After 3 years of silence from his children, Art's $2.3 million lottery win brings them running back, but not for the reasons he hoped. Arthur Bradley sat at his kitchen table with the same calculator he'd used for 15 years, its plastic buttons worn smooth from countless sessions of financial arithmetic. The device bore the weight of his fingerprints, accumulated oils from decades of pressing the same numbers in the same desperate combinations. The small LCD screen flickered occasionally, a sign of its advancing age, but Art couldn't afford to replace even this most essential tool of his survival mathematics. The kitchen table itself told stories of accommodation and careful use. Purchased at a discount furniture store 30 years ago when he and Linda had first moved to this neighborhood, its laminated surface showed rings from countless coffee cups, scratches from hasty note-taking during bill-paying sessions, and the particular wear pattern of a man who conducted all his important business in this single location. The table wobbled slightly on an uneven leg that Art had attempted to fix multiple times with folded napkins and strategic positioning, but like so many things in his life, it required constant adjustment to maintain stability. The small device had become his confessor, the only witness to the monthly ritual of dividing insufficient funds among necessary expenses. Each month brought the same arithmetic of survival, the same painful calculations that reduced his existence to columns of numbers that never balanced in his favor. Heat or medication this month? Not both. Never both. This was the mathematics of aging in America, the cruel algebra of fixed incomes meeting variable expenses in a contest that poverty always won. The apartment carried the particular silence of a place where conversations had died years ago, a quietude so complete that Art had learned to distinguish between different qualities of emptiness. Morning silence felt different from afternoon silence, which carried distinct characteristics from the heavy quiet of evening hours, when the absence of television voices from neighboring apartments reminded him that other people shared their evenings with family members who cared about their opinions and experiences. This was not the peaceful silence of contentment, but the oppressive quiet of abandonment, filled with the absence of voices that should have been there. Art could remember when this apartment had hummed with activity, when Linda would call from the kitchen while he read the evening paper, when the phone would ring with calls from his children asking for advice or sharing news about their lives. Now the silence felt alive, a presence that observed his routines with judgment and found them lacking. Clean but sparse, every surface organized with the precision of a man who had too much time and too little purpose. Art had developed cleaning routines that consumed hours because hours needed consuming. He dusted furniture that rarely accumulated dust, organized drawers that contained too few items to become disorganized, and maintained systems of order that served no function beyond providing structure to days that otherwise stretched endlessly toward bedtime. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, a white noise that had become so constant Art only noticed it when it occasionally cycled off, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt threatening. The ancient appliance, purchased during his marriage and now showing its age in rust spots around the door seals and interior shelves that had cracked from years of expansion and contraction, worked harder than it should have needed to. Its motor strained against seals that had lost their effectiveness years ago, causing it to run almost continuously during summer months when his reluctance to use air conditioning made the kitchen uncomfortably warm. Art knew he should replace the refrigerator, but the mathematics of his monthly budget made such purchases impossible. Instead, he had learned to work around its limitations, to shop more frequently for smaller amounts of food that wouldn't spoil if the cooling system finally failed, to accept that leftovers would develop ice crystals or strange textures faster than they should. The refrigerator had become a metaphor for his entire existence, functional but failing, requiring constant accommodation, serving its purpose but reminding him daily of better times when replacement and improvement had been possibilities rather than fantasies. The white noise was punctuated only by the distant rumble of delivery trucks navigating the narrow streets of his working-class neighborhood, a reminder that the world continued its business outside his windows. These trucks brought packages to neighbors who had people to send them gifts, delivered furniture to families who could afford improvements, carried away garbage from households that generated enough waste to require regular collection. Art's own trash output had diminished over the years, a metric of isolation he had not anticipated measuring. Single garbage bags that lasted him weeks, recycling bins that rarely filled, mailboxes that contained only bills and advertisements for services he couldn't afford. On the refrigerator door, held by a magnet shaped like a wrench, a retirement gift from the factory floor, given to him by colleagues who had pooled their money for something they thought he might find useful in his home projects, hung a birthday card. 5 years old now, its corners softened with age and handling, the envelope long since discarded but the card itself preserved like a pressed flower, a specimen of a relationship that had once bloomed. The magnet itself carried memories of his final day at Mansfield Manufacturing, when his supervisor had gathered the night shift crew for cake and awkward speeches about his 32 years of service. Men who had worked alongside him for decades, who had shared coffee breaks and complained about management decisions and covered for each other during family emergencies, had struggled to find words for this transition that everyone understood as a beginning of the end. Retirement was supposed to be a reward, but everyone knew it was also a kind of death, a removal from the community of purpose that had defined their adult lives. Art knew every word inside the birthday card by heart. "Hope you're well, Dad. Thinking of you on your special day." Janet's handwriting, careful and distant, formed in the measured script she had developed as a real estate agent, professional and controlled. No signature of love, no "love, Janet," or even "your daughter." Just polite acknowledgement that he continued to exist, a courtesy extended to someone who had once been important, but was now merely an obligation to be minimally satisfied. The card had arrived in the mail on his 66th birthday, unexpected and treasured despite its careful emotional distance. He had read it dozens of times that first day, searching for hidden meanings in the choice of words, hope in the fact that she had remembered the date at all. The simple act of receiving mail addressed to him personally, rather than to resident or current occupant, had felt like a small miracle. For weeks afterward, he had expected a follow-up call, perhaps an invitation to lunch, maybe a request to meet the grandchildren he saw only in photographs shared by mutual acquaintances who still maintained contact with both sides of their family schism. No call had come, no invitation, no acknowledgement that sending a card might suggest a desire for reconnection. The card remained on his refrigerator as evidence that he had children who knew he existed, a small proof of relationship that visitors might notice if he ever had visitors to notice such things. Most days, Art avoided looking directly at it, but some mornings, like this morning, his eyes would fix on Janet's handwriting, and he would remember what it felt like to be someone's father, someone whose opinions mattered and whose presence was desired. The morning light filtered through windows that faced east, catching the dust motes that danced above framed photographs arranged on the narrow windowsill. The apartment's orientation meant that Art woke naturally with the sunrise, a pattern that had developed during his factory years when early rising was necessary for the night shift, and had continued into retirement when sleeping late offered no advantage and often led to longer days with less structure. 3 grandchildren frozen in school pictures, their faces aging in his memory as birthdays passed uncelebrated. Emma would be 13 now, a teenager whose interests and personality remained mysteries to him. Tyler, 12, probably playing sports or learning instruments or developing the interests that would shape his character. Little Sarah, barely 8 when the silence began, would be 11 now, old enough to ask questions about her grandfather that her parents would need to deflect or explain with carefully constructed half-truths. He calculated their ages like a mathematician tracking time, updating mental files they would never know existed. Art wondered if they remembered him at all, if their parents had maintained the fiction that Grandpa was going through a difficult time, or if they had simply been told he was no longer part of their lives. The thought that his grandchildren might have been told he didn't want to see them felt like physical pain, a tightness in his chest that accompanied his worst moments of self-doubt and regret. In the bedroom closet, behind winter coats that rarely left their hangers in this climate-controlled building, 7 wrapped birthday presents waited in accusation. Each year, Art purchased gifts for children who would never receive them, a ritual of hope that had transformed into evidence of his own foolishness. Yet he continued, unable to stop believing that somehow, someday, these tokens of love might find their intended recipients. The presents represented hours of careful shopping, attention to age-appropriate choices, consideration of interests he could only guess at based on outdated information and wishful thinking. For Emma, books that he hoped might match her reading level and interests. For Tyler, model airplane kits and building sets that reflected Art's own mechanical inclinations. For Sarah, art supplies and games that seemed suitable for a girl whose personality remained completely unknown to him. Each year, wrapping these gifts required emotional preparation. Art would spread wrapping paper on his dining room table, arrange scissors and tape and ribbon with the precision of a craftsman, and attempt to create packages that would convey love across years of separation. The act of writing their names on gift tags felt both hopeful and heartbreaking, an assertion of relationship that existed primarily in his imagination. The presents accumulated in his closet like archaeological layers, marking time and documenting his inability to accept reality. Sometimes Art would open the closet door and stare at these wrapped packages, wondering if maintaining this ritual made him a devoted grandfather or a pathetic old man who couldn't admit defeat. The gifts served no practical purpose, brought no joy to their intended recipients, and caused him financial strain he could ill afford. Yet he continued wrapping presents each year, adding to the collection of love that had nowhere to go. The coffee mug in his hands bore the faded logo of Mansfield Manufacturing, where he had supervised the night shift for 32 years. The ceramic showed hairline cracks from years of thermal stress, the handle worn smooth from thousands of grips, the interior stained despite regular washing. They had given him this mug, along with a modest pension that barely covered rent and groceries, when his knees finally convinced him that climbing metal stairs in a factory was a young man's game. The mug held coffee now, but it had once held the pride of a man who understood machinery, who could diagnose problems and implement solutions, who was valued for his experience and judgment. Art remembered the satisfaction of walking through the factory floor, hearing the rhythm of machinery operating smoothly, knowing that his oversight and decision-making contributed to production goals and quality standards. He had been someone important in that environment, someone whose absence would be noticed and whose opinions carried weight. That man felt like a stranger now, a character from someone else's story. The transition from essential employee to expendable retiree had been more jarring than Art had anticipated. He had expected to miss the paycheck, had prepared for the financial adjustment that retirement would require. He had not expected to miss being needed, to discover that his sense of worth had been so completely tied to his professional usefulness that retirement felt like a kind of death. The factory had provided more than employment. It had offered community, routine, purpose, and identity. Night shift workers developed particular bonds, sharing the experience of working while the rest of the world slept, depending on each other for safety and efficiency in ways that day shift workers never quite understood. They had been brothers in the peculiar fraternity of manufacturing, men who solved problems with their hands and measured success in units produced and quality maintained. Art pressed the calculator's buttons with deliberate precision, muscle memory guiding his fingers through calculations he could perform in his sleep. Social Security, $1,847. Pension, $623. The two income sources that defined his economic reality, amounts that had seemed reasonable when he first learned about them, but proved inadequate when tested against the actual costs of independent living. Rent, $875. The amount consumed more than a third of his total income, leaving him vulnerable to any unexpected expenses or changes in his financial situation. Art lived in constant awareness that a significant rent increase would force him to move, probably to a smaller apartment in a less safe neighborhood, definitely away from the few remaining connections he had to community and familiar surroundings. Utilities, estimated $180 in winter, when heating costs dominated his budget and forced him to make uncomfortable choices about comfort versus affordability. Art had learned to heat only the rooms he actively occupied, wearing sweaters and blankets indoors, timing his thermostat adjustments to minimize energy consumption while maintaining enough warmth to prevent pipes from freezing. Summer brought different challenges, when his reluctance to use air conditioning left him sweltering in his apartment, while neighbors enjoyed climate-controlled comfort he couldn't afford. Groceries, if he was careful, $200. This amount required strategic shopping, attention to sales and coupons, acceptance of generic brands and cheaper cuts of meat, careful meal planning that minimized waste and maximized nutrition within strict financial constraints. Art had become an expert in poverty cuisine, learning to prepare filling meals from inexpensive ingredients, stretching protein sources with grains and vegetables, making single purchases serve multiple meals through creative leftover management. Medication, $290 for the blood pressure pills that kept his cardiovascular system stable, cholesterol medication that his doctor insisted was necessary for long-term health, and the prescription reading glasses he needed but couldn't quite afford to replace when his prescription changed. The medication costs represented the most non-negotiable item in his budget, expenses that would increase with age and changing health needs, creating financial pressure that would only worsen over time. The numbers never lied, never offered false comfort or optimistic projections. They simply presented reality in digits that demanded accommodation, adjustment, and acceptance. Art had learned to work within these constraints with the resignation of a man who understood that complaining about mathematics was pointless. But the daily confrontation with insufficient resources wore on his spirit in ways he struggled to articulate. He had become an expert at accommodation, developing skills in financial management that he had never needed during his working years, when steady paychecks and predictable expenses created manageable monthly budgets. Generic brands instead of name brands, a transition that required adjusting his expectations about taste and quality, while accepting that loyalty to familiar products was a luxury he could no longer afford. Walking to the grocery store instead of driving when weather permitted, a practice that saved gasoline costs while providing exercise and extending the life of his 15-year-old Honda Civic. The car represented another source of anxiety, a mechanical system that required maintenance and occasional repairs that could devastate his monthly budget. Art had learned basic automotive maintenance, changing his own oil and replacing simple parts, but major repairs remained beyond his financial reach and mechanical expertise. Turning the heat down to 65 degrees and wearing sweaters his ex-wife had knitted 20 years ago, before their marriage crumbled under the weight of his inability to express feelings and her growing resentment of his emotional distance. The sweaters carried memories of happier times, when Linda would spend winter evenings working on projects that demonstrated care and investment in their shared future. Now, they served as insulation against both cold and the irony of receiving warmth from someone who had ultimately found him inadequate as a partner. The divorce hadn't surprised him when it finally happened, though the timing had caught him off guard. Linda had tried for years to crack through his shell, to reach the man she believed existed beneath layers of Midwestern reserve and masculine conditioning. She had suggested counseling, initiated conversations about feelings and communication, organized social activities that might help him develop friendships and emotional outlets beyond their marriage. Art had participated reluctantly, understanding intellectually that she needed something from him that he didn't know how to provide, but unable to access the emotional vocabulary that might have satisfied her needs. But Art had learned early that feelings were private matters, that a man's job was to provide and protect, not to share fears or vulnerabilities. His father had demonstrated masculinity through stoic endurance, reliable employment, and emotional control that never cracked under pressure. Art had internalized these lessons so completely that Linda's requests for emotional intimacy felt like requests to betray his fundamental nature, to abandon the principles that had shaped his understanding of what it meant to be a good man. When she finally left, he felt relief mixed with loneliness, understanding that she deserved more than he knew how to give, yet mourning the loss of companionship and the failure of his attempts to be the husband she needed. The divorce proceedings had been civil but painful, dividing assets and making arrangements that acknowledged the end of 23 years of marriage with legal documents and financial settlements that reduced their shared life to property divisions and support obligations. 20 years of solitude had followed. 20 years of eating dinner alone, developing preferences that served only his own tastes, learning to cook for one person in ways that minimized waste and provided adequate nutrition without the pleasure of sharing meals with someone whose company he enjoyed. He had grown comfortable with this smaller life, convincing himself that independence was a virtue, that needing others was a weakness he had outgrown through experience and practical necessity. Art had developed routines that filled time without requiring significant emotional investment or social interaction. Television shows that provided background noise without demanding attention, crossword puzzles that exercised his mind, while consuming hours that might otherwise be spent in loneliness, household projects that created the illusion of productivity, while serving no purpose beyond occupying his hands and attention. Then Dollars had arrived like an unexpected gift, disrupting his carefully constructed isolation with possibilities he had convinced himself he no longer wanted or needed. She was 63 to his 68, recently widowed after 40 years of marriage, with a smile that seemed genuine and an interest in his stories about factory life that felt intoxicating after years of having no audience for his memories and experiences. They met at a community center event he had attended reluctantly, drawn by advertisements for free coffee and the promise of social interaction that didn't require significant emotional investment or ongoing obligation. The event itself had been disappointing, a presentation about senior services that Art couldn't afford and didn't need, delivered by social workers who spoke with condescending cheerfulness about maintaining independence and staying active, in ways that revealed their assumption that elderly people were problems to be managed rather than individuals with complex lives and legitimate needs. Art had planned to leave after the coffee and cookies, but Dollars had approached his table where he sat alone, asked if she could join him, and proceeded to listen to his opinions about current events with attention that felt miraculous after years of having no one to share his thoughts with. For 8 months, Art experienced something he had forgotten existed, the pleasure of anticipation. Dollars would call in the evenings, and he would find himself looking forward to her voice, planning topics of conversation, preparing stories that might amuse or interest her. She would suggest activities, movies at the discount theater, restaurants within his budget, walks in the park that allowed conversation without the pressure of maintaining eye contact during difficult topics, and he would agree, rediscovering the satisfaction of planning for another person's happiness. Dollars seemed to appreciate his practical knowledge and life experience in ways that made him feel valuable and interesting. She asked for his advice about car repairs and household maintenance, listened to his explanations of how things worked, and expressed admiration for his ability to solve problems and fix things that were broken. After years of feeling useless and irrelevant, Art found himself remembering what it felt like to be competent and needed. When she suggested marriage, Art felt a combination of surprise and gratitude. At 68, he hadn't expected another chance at companionship, had convinced himself that romantic relationships were experiences that belonged to his past rather than possibilities for his future. The proposal emerged naturally from their deepening friendship, presented as a practical arrangement that would benefit both of them financially and emotionally while acknowledging that they were too old for dramatic passion, but not too old for mutual care and support. The ceremony was small, conducted at City Hall with 2 witnesses provided by the staff, and a justice of the peace who performed dozens of such ceremonies each month with professional efficiency and genuine warmth. Art wore his best suit, purchased for his retirement party and still presentable despite its age, and felt something approaching contentment as he spoke vows he intended to keep. The rings were simple gold bands purchased at a jewelry store that offered senior discounts, symbols of commitment that reflected their practical approach to late-life romance. For the first time in 20 years, Art had someone to cook for, someone to consider when making plans, someone whose opinions mattered and whose presence made his apartment feel less like a waiting room and more like a home. Dollars brought her own furniture and possessions, creating a blend of their separate lives that required negotiation and compromise, but also provided evidence that he was no longer alone in the world. His children's reaction had been swift and brutal, delivered through phone calls that revealed levels of anger and disappointment Art hadn't anticipated and wasn't prepared to handle. "Dad, are you insane?" Janet's voice through the phone had carried a tone he remembered from her teenage years, when she believed his rules were unreasonable and his judgment flawed. "You barely know this woman. What if she's after your money? What money do you even have that she could be after? This is embarrassing." The conversation had continued for nearly an hour, with Janet cycling through arguments that questioned his mental capacity, his understanding of modern dating dangers, and his ability to make rational decisions about relationships. She had researched Dollars online, had found information about her deceased husband's modest estate and her own financial situation, had constructed a narrative about predatory women who targeted lonely elderly men for financial exploitation. David had been more direct. "This is embarrassing, Dad. What are people going to think? You think someone wants to marry you for your pension. You're having some kind of crisis. Maybe you should talk to someone, get some counseling before you make decisions you're going to regret." The accusation of mental instability had been particularly painful, suggesting that his children viewed normal human desires for companionship and affection as evidence of cognitive decline or emotional breakdown. David had spoken to him as if he were a confused child rather than an adult man capable of making informed decisions about his own life. The accusations had stung, partly because they forced Art to examine his own motivations with uncomfortable honesty. Had he married Dollars out of loneliness? Probably. Did that make the marriage invalid or unwise? He didn't think so. But his children's disapproval had planted seeds of doubt that Dollars seemed to water with increasing frequency, as their marriage progressed beyond the honeymoon phase of mutual consideration and into the practical realities of sharing living space with someone whose habits and expectations were different from his own. She had opinions about his apartment, his furniture, his reluctance to spend money on improvements she deemed necessary for their comfort and social standing. The apartment was too small, she said, inadequate for a married couple who deserved better after working hard their entire lives. His furniture was outdated and worn, embarrassing when they had company, reflecting poorly on their combined dignity and self-respect. Dollars suggested they combine finances completely, pool their Social Security and pension benefits to qualify for a larger apartment in a better neighborhood, take trips that would require dipping into the small savings account he had guarded carefully for emergencies. When he expressed reluctance, explaining his anxiety about financial security and his preference for conservative spending, she would become sullen, accusing him of not trusting her, of treating her like a stranger instead of a wife, of being selfish with resources that should benefit both of them equally. The arguments about money revealed deeper incompatibilities about lifestyle and expectations that had been hidden during their courtship by mutual politeness and the desire to present their best selves to each other. Dollars had married expecting improvement in her circumstances, anticipating that their combined resources would provide opportunities for travel and entertainment that had been impossible on her widow's budget. Art had married expecting companionship within his existing lifestyle, imagining someone who would share his modest routines rather than demanding upgrades he couldn't afford. The marriage lasted 11 months, a period that began with hope and deteriorated gradually through disappointment, resentment, and ultimately mutual recognition that they had married ideas of each other rather than the people they actually were. Dollars left on a Tuesday morning while Art was at his weekly doctor's appointment, a regularly scheduled visit for blood pressure monitoring that had become routine over the years. He returned to find half the furniture gone, including pieces he had owned for decades, along with most of their shared wedding gifts and the emergency savings account that now showed a balance of $37. She had taken the newer appliances, the television, the microwave, several pieces of his tools, and most of the food from the refrigerator and pantry. She had left a note on the kitchen counter, written in the same careful handwriting he remembered from greeting cards and shopping lists. "This isn't working. I need someone who's ready for a real partnership. I thought you wanted a wife, but you just wanted a roommate who didn't cost anything. I deserve better than this." Art sat in his emptied apartment, surrounded by gaps where furniture had once stood, rectangular areas of unfaded carpet that marked the locations of missing dressers and chairs, and felt a shame deeper than he had known possible. Not just the shame of being abandoned by someone he had trusted, but the shame of proving his children right. They had predicted this outcome with the confidence of people who understood the world better than he did, and he had ignored their warnings because he wanted to believe that someone could love him without agenda or ulterior motive. The financial damage was severe but not catastrophic. Dollars had taken money that Art couldn't afford to lose, but she hadn't left him destitute. The emotional damage was worse, a profound embarrassment about his naivety, and a confirmation of his children's assessment that he was too old and foolish to make good decisions about relationships or money. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and stupid in ways that made him reluctant to leave his apartment or interact with neighbors who might have observed his brief marriage and subsequent abandonment. The phone calls to his children had gone unreturned, despite messages that began with apologies and admissions that they had been right about Dollars and his poor judgment. The letters he sent, attempting to explain what had happened and express regret for not listening to their concerns, came back marked "Return to sender" with no forwarding address. His grandchildren, who had barely known him before the marriage, became complete strangers whose lives continued without any acknowledgement of his existence. Janet changed her phone number within weeks of Dollars' departure. David blocked him on social media platforms where Art had occasionally glimpsed photos of family gatherings and milestone celebrations. Art learned about Tyler's graduation from middle school through a neighbor who mentioned seeing the family at a restaurant celebration he hadn't been invited to attend, hadn't known was happening, couldn't have afforded to properly recognize with appropriate gifts or congratulations. 3 years of silence had followed. 3 years of wondering if his children would call on his birthday, if they would reach out during holidays, if some emergency or celebration might break through their determined distance. 3 years of checking his phone each morning with hope that curdled into disappointment before breakfast was finished, of monitoring the mail for cards or letters that never arrived, of maintaining readiness for reconciliation that his children showed no interest in pursuing. Abandonment had moved into his life like a tenant who never paid rent but couldn't be evicted, an unwelcome presence that provided constant commentary on every interaction, every decision, every moment of potential happiness. It whispered constantly, offering explanations for why people behaved as they did, predictions about how relationships would inevitably disappoint, reminders about his fundamental unworthiness and the temporary nature of any affection or consideration he might receive from others. When neighbors greeted him in the hallway, abandonment reminded him that this politeness was temporary, that eventually everyone discovered he wasn't worth sustained effort or genuine friendship. When he considered joining activities at the community center, abandonment suggested that his own children's rejection proved he had nothing valuable to offer strangers, that his presence would be tolerated rather than welcomed, that he would embarrass himself and others by presuming to belong in social situations where his inadequacies would become obvious. Most insidiously, abandonment had convinced him that his need for connection was pathetic, that healthy people didn't require external validation or frequent contact with family members, that his longing for family contact was evidence of weakness rather than normal human desire for belonging and love. Real men, abandonment insisted, didn't chase after people who had made their preferences clear, didn't beg for attention from children who had clearly outgrown their need for fathers, didn't embarrass themselves by continuing to hope for reconciliation when the message of rejection had been delivered clearly and consistently. Abandonment had become his most constant companion, more reliable than family, more consistent than friends, always available to provide perspective that emphasized his failures and predicted future disappointments. It lived in his apartment like an invisible roommate, commenting on his routines, analyzing his choices, explaining why his hopes were unrealistic and his efforts to connect with others were doomed to failure. The lottery ticket lay beside his coffee mug, forgotten until this moment of calculation. The small slip of paper represented hope in its most distilled form, a weekly ritual that had continued for 20 years despite mathematical evidence that winning was virtually impossible. Every Tuesday for 2 decades, Art had purchased the same ticket at Corner Market, playing numbers that corresponded to his children's birthdays: 4, 15, 23, 27, 30, 139. $2 he could barely afford, a small weekly ritual that represented faith in possibility and change despite years of evidence that his circumstances were permanent, and his luck was consistently poor. The lottery ticket was his only rebellion against practical thinking, his single indulgence in magical thinking that contradicted everything he understood about probability and financial responsibility. $2 that could have purchased additional food or contributed to his medicine fund, instead supported a fantasy that had never materialized and statistically never would. Yet Art continued buying tickets with the persistence of a man who understood that hope required regular maintenance, even when hope seemed foolish and economically irresponsible. This Tuesday had begun like any other. Wake at sunrise, coffee and calculator session, light breakfast, walk to Corner Market for milk and bread and human contact with Mrs. Chen behind the counter who knew his name, and asked about his health with genuine concern that felt precious, because it was the only such inquiry he received from week to week. The routine had become so automatic that purchasing the lottery ticket required no conscious decision, just the muscle memory of reaching for his wallet and requesting the usual numbers that Mrs. Chen would input without requiring him to specify. Exchange pleasantries about weather and neighborhood news, purchase the lottery ticket without expecting anything beyond the brief fantasy of possibility it provided, return home with groceries that would last until the next week's shopping expedition. The routine had become so automatic that Art barely remembered the transaction until he sat down Wednesday morning with his coffee and the local newspaper, scanning headlines about local politics and weather forecasts while eating toast with margarine and generic jam. The numbers stared back at him from page 3, familiar as his own reflection. 4-15-23, 27-30, 139. The same numbers he had played faithfully for 20 years, the birthdays of children who no longer acknowledged his existence, transformed from sentimental gesture into mathematical miracle. Art checked the ticket 3 times before consulting the newspaper's explanation of prize amounts, unable to believe that the numbers that had represented hope for so many years had finally aligned with reality. Not the jackpot, which would have been more money than he could comprehend or manage responsibly, but the second prize, $2.3 million after taxes, an amount that would transform his circumstances completely while remaining manageable and comprehensible. He sat motionless for an hour, the coffee growing cold in his cup, the calculator forgotten beside numbers that no longer mattered. His mind struggled to process this shift in circumstances, to understand what it meant for a man who had grown accustomed to limitation and disappointment, who had learned to manage expectations and find satisfaction within narrow constraints that no longer applied to his situation. His first thought was of Janet and David. They would want to know. They would be proud of their father's good fortune, excited about the possibilities this money represented for their own financial security and their children's future opportunities. They would call to congratulate him, to discuss how this windfall might benefit the entire family, to re-establish contact that had been interrupted by misunderstandings that now seemed trivial compared to the potential for renewed relationship. His second thought was darker, more realistic. They would want to know because they would want access to what he had won. Their sudden interest in his welfare would be directly proportional to their interest in his money, a correlation that would reveal the true nature of their previous abandonment and current motivation for reconciliation. The lottery win would serve as a test of their character and his own significance in their lives beyond his potential utility as a financial resource. Art walked to the bank that afternoon, the lottery ticket secured in his shirt pocket, pressed against his chest like a secret that could change everything or destroy the small remaining hope he maintained for genuine reconciliation with his children. The process of claiming the prize felt surreal, involving paperwork and verification procedures that transformed his life, while he sat in plastic chairs under fluorescent lights, surrounded by other people conducting routine banking business that had nothing to do with the miracle occurring at window number 3. The officials were professional and congratulatory, explaining tax implications and payment options with the practiced efficiency of people who managed other people's dreams for a living. They had seen lottery winners before, understood the emotional complexity of sudden wealth, provided information about financial planning and investment options, with the mixture of excitement and caution that characterized responsible money management in extraordinary circumstances. 2 weeks later, Art's bank account contained more money than he had earned in his entire working life, yet he continued living exactly as before. Same apartment, same careful budgeting, same morning routine with the calculator and coffee. The only change was the knowledge that his financial calculations were no longer necessary for survival, that he could afford heat and medication simultaneously, that the mathematics of poverty no longer applied to his daily existence. He told no one about the win, partly from a lifetime of financial privacy, and partly from curiosity about what would happen if the news emerged naturally through newspaper articles or community gossip. He wanted to see if his phone would ring, if his children would reach out motivated by genuine interest in his welfare or obvious attraction to his improved circumstances. Art wanted to observe their response without the complication of his own disclosure, to understand whether they would contact him because they loved him or because they wanted something from him. The experiment felt necessary and painful, a scientific approach to questions about family relationships that he had avoided confronting directly for 3 years. During those weeks of secret wealth, Art conducted conversations with imagined versions of his children, debates that played out while he prepared simple meals and watched evening news programs that felt increasingly irrelevant to his circumstances. These internal dialogues revealed feelings and perspectives that he had been unable to express during their actual relationship, thoughts that had been suppressed by his desire to maintain family harmony and his reluctance to appear critical or demanding. "You think I'm a fool with money?" he would ask Janet's photograph, the framed picture from her college graduation that showed her young and hopeful and proud of her father's presence at her achievement. "I managed to raise you and your brother on a factory wage, kept food on the table, clothes on your backs, sent you both to college without debt, paid for your wedding, helped with the down payment on your first house. But one mistake with dollars and suddenly I'm incompetent. Suddenly I can't be trusted to make decisions about my own life." To David's senior picture, taken the year he graduated high school with honor roll recognition and football scholarships that had made Art proud beyond words. "You were so worried about me being taken advantage of. What about me being taken advantage of by my own children? Where were you when dollars cleaned out our savings account? Where were you when I had the heart attack 6 months later and spent 3 days in the hospital with no visitors, no flowers, no phone calls to check if I was alive or dead?" These one-sided conversations revealed truths Art had been afraid to acknowledge. His children's abandonment wasn't really about dollars or his supposed lack of judgment. It was about their discomfort with his humanity, his right to make mistakes and still be worthy of love and support from people who claimed to care about his welfare. They had appointed themselves judges of his character based on a single decision, then punished him with silence when that decision proved flawed, as if perfect judgment was a requirement for maintaining family relationships. More painfully, Art began to understand that his children saw him as an embarrassment rather than a victim. His marriage to dollars had reflected poorly on their family image, suggested that their father was gullible and desperate rather than simply lonely and hopeful. His subsequent abandonment by her had confirmed their assessment of his foolishness, providing evidence they could point to when explaining to friends and extended family why they had distanced themselves from someone whose decision-making had become unreliable. They had withdrawn not to protect themselves from his poor judgment, but to distance themselves from the shame of being associated with a man who had been so publicly made a fool. Their abandonment was about protecting their own reputation and social standing rather than expressing disappointment in his choices or concern for his future welfare. 3 weeks after claiming the lottery prize, Art's phone rang during the dinner hour, a time when calls were rare and usually involved sales pitches or wrong numbers. He recognized Janet's number immediately, though he hadn't seen it on his screen for 3 years, hadn't heard her voice since the angry conversations that followed Dollar's departure and his admission that their warnings had been accurate. "Dad, it's me." Her voice carried nervous energy, the tone of someone making a difficult call that required courage and careful preparation. I heard about your lottery win. It was in the local paper." Art's heart performed complicated rhythms as he processed this moment he had anticipated and dreaded. Here was contact, the acknowledgement he had craved for 3 years, arriving precisely when his circumstances had changed in ways that made such contact suspect. The timing was too coincidental to ignore, too convenient to accept at face value. "I wanted to call and, well, congratulate you, and maybe we could get together. Talk about things. I feel like we've been out of touch for too long." The phrase "out of touch" struck Art as carefully chosen, a euphemism that avoided acknowledging the deliberate nature of their separation or accepting responsibility for maintaining distance that had been purposeful rather than accidental. They hadn't been out of touch, like busy people who meant to call but forgot. They had actively avoided contact despite his repeated attempts to re-establish communication. Art looked around his small apartment, at the photographs of grandchildren who didn't know him, at the unopened birthday presents in his bedroom closet, at the evidence of a life that had continued in their absence. He could say yes. He could use this money as a bridge back to them, pretend that timing was coincidental, that his windfall had nothing to do with their sudden interest in reconciliation. He could purchase their renewed attention and affection, secure their presence in his life through financial incentive, and pretend that money hadn't changed the fundamental nature of their relationship. Instead, he surprised himself with honesty that had been building during 3 years of abandonment and 2 weeks of secret wealth. "Janet, honey, I've been waiting 3 years for you to call me. 3 years of birthdays and holidays and hoping you'd remember you had a father. What's different now? Dad, we were hurt about dollars, about how I tried to find companionship after 20 years of being divorced. How I made a mistake trusting the wrong person. How I was human." The silence that followed felt heavy with years of unspoken resentment and misunderstanding. Art could hear Janet breathing, could imagine her in whatever house she lived in now, surrounded by the family life he had been excluded from, struggling to find words that would justify 3 years of silence without acknowledging the cruelty of abandoning someone who needed support during his most vulnerable period. "We thought you weren't thinking clearly," she said finally. "We were trying to protect you." "From what?" "From living my own life, from making my own decisions. You didn't protect me, Janet. You punished me. There's a difference." Over the following week, both children called repeatedly. Their approaches were different, but their underlying message was consistent. They wanted to rebuild the relationship, to create new memories, to involve Art in family activities he had been excluded from for years. The conversations felt scripted, carefully planned discussions that avoided acknowledging their previous behavior, while focusing on future possibilities that conveniently aligned with his improved financial circumstances. David suggested a family vacation to Florida, a destination that had never been discussed during Art's years of poverty, but suddenly seemed appropriate for their renewed relationship. Janet mentioned that the grandchildren asked about Grandpa all the time, a statement Art knew was false based on Tyler's confused expression when David brought him for an unannounced visit that felt more like a job interview than a family reunion. The boy was 12 now, nearly a teenager, with features Art could recognize as family heritage but mannerisms that belonged to strangers. Tyler seemed uncomfortable in Art's apartment, glancing frequently at his phone, responding to questions with monosyllables that suggested this reunion was his father's idea rather than his own desire. His discomfort was obvious and painful, evidence that he had been coached for this encounter, rather than expressing genuine interest in meeting his grandfather. "Dad, Tyler's been wanting to meet his grandfather," David said, the coaching evident in his tone. "We've told him so many stories about you." Art studied this grandson he had missed watching grow up, this child who had been taught to think of his grandfather as someone whose love was conditional on his parents' approval. "What kind of stories?" he asked Tyler directly. The boy shrugged. "Just that you worked in a factory and stuff." "And stuff?" Art nodded, understanding that his grandchildren knew him as a biographical footnote rather than a living person who had longed to be part of their lives. They had been given minimal information, presented with a grandfather who existed in their family history, but not their current reality, someone who might be mentioned occasionally but never expected to participate in their actual experiences. The manipulation became increasingly obvious as the conversations continued. They wanted him to establish college funds for the grandchildren, to invest in Janet's real estate business, to participate in David's family investment opportunities that would benefit everyone while ensuring that his wealth remained within family control. Their interest in his company was directly proportional to their interest in his money, a correlation that would have been insulting if it weren't so transparent. Art found himself gaining clarity with each phone call. These people hadn't abandoned him because he showed poor judgment. They had abandoned him because he embarrassed them, and now they were back because he had something they wanted. This wasn't love returning. This was business proposing a partnership that would benefit everyone except the person providing the capital. The realization was liberating and devastating simultaneously. Liberating because it revealed the truth about relationships he had idealized despite evidence to the contrary. Devastating because it confirmed that his children's love had been conditional on his utility, that family loyalty was subject to cost-benefit analysis, that he had been discarded when he became inconvenient and was being reclaimed now that he had become valuable. 2 months after Janet's first call, Art made decisions that surprised everyone, including himself. He established trust funds for his grandchildren, but structured them so the money couldn't be accessed until age 25, and only if the recipients had maintained independent relationships with their grandfather. The legal language was specific and unambiguous. College funding would be available only to grandchildren who visited him regularly, who included him in their lives genuinely rather than financially, who demonstrated that their affection wasn't contingent on his wealth. He donated significant portions to organizations that helped elderly people maintain connections with family members who had cut them off, recognizing that his experience wasn't unique, and that other seniors faced similar abandonment without the resources to protect themselves or demand better treatment. The donations provided tax benefits while supporting causes that addressed social problems he had experienced personally. He kept enough to live comfortably but not extravagantly, ensuring that his improved circumstances would enhance his life without making him a target for additional manipulation or exploitation. The remaining money would provide security, medical care, and modest luxuries, while remaining insufficient to fundamentally alter his children's financial circumstances through inheritance or gifts. When he called a family meeting to discuss these decisions, Janet and David arrived expecting to negotiate financial arrangements that would benefit everyone involved. Instead, they found their father sitting in his small living room with legal documents and a calmness they didn't recognize, prepared to establish boundaries that would govern their future interactions. "I want you to know," Art said, "that the money doesn't change what happened between us. You abandoned me when I needed you most. You kept my grandchildren from me. You decided I was disposable." "Dad, we want to make things right," Janet began. "No, you want to make things profitable. There's a difference." David shifted uncomfortably, his businessman's instincts recognizing unfavorable negotiating terms. "We made mistakes, Dad. We're trying to fix them." "You made choices," Art corrected. "For 3 years you chose to exclude me from your lives. You chose to keep my grandchildren from knowing their grandfather. You chose to ignore my phone calls and return my letters unopened. Those weren't mistakes. They were decisions." The conversation that followed forced confrontations that had been avoided for years. Janet eventually broke down, admitting that their anger about Dollars had been mixed with shame about their father's perceived foolishness. "When you married her, it felt like you were replacing Mom's memory. And then when she left you, we felt vindicated, I guess, like we'd been proven right about everything. But that didn't give us the right to cut you out completely," David added with visible reluctance. "We were protecting our own feelings instead of caring about yours." Art appreciated their honesty while recognizing its limitations. Understanding their motivations didn't obligate him to excuse their behavior or pretend that explanations erased the damage their choices had caused. "You were adults," he said. "You had children of your own. You knew what family obligations meant, and you chose to ignore them when they became inconvenient." Tyler, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke. "Grandpa, I did ask about you. I asked a lot, but they always said you were going through things and we needed to give you space." This revelation broke Art's heart and hardened his resolve simultaneously. His grandchildren had been told lies to justify their parents' choices, had been deprived of relationships they might have wanted to maintain, had been taught to think of their grandfather as someone who didn't want to see them rather than someone who had been prevented from contact. "The trust funds will be there when you're 25, Art told Tyler directly. "But more importantly, you're welcome to visit me anytime you want to know your grandfather. That invitation doesn't depend on your parents' approval anymore." 6 months later, Art lived in a nicer apartment in a senior community where he had discovered the pleasure of neighbors who shared similar experiences and limitations. The building offered activities and social opportunities without the pressure of family obligation or romantic complication. Weekly card games, book clubs, exercise classes designed for senior capabilities, and social events that provided companionship without demanding emotional investment beyond polite friendship. He was taking art classes, had joined a woodworking group, and volunteered at a literacy program where his patience and practical knowledge were valued by adult learners who appreciated his teaching style and genuine interest in their progress. These activities provided purpose and community without the complications that had characterized his family relationships, offering opportunities to be useful and appreciated in contexts where his contributions were welcomed rather than evaluated. Most surprisingly, he was dating Elena Rodriguez, a 70-year-old widow who had approached him at a community center dance with the same directness that had once attracted him to Dolars. The difference was that Elena knew nothing about his lottery winnings when they met, was attracted to his conversation and companionship rather than his potential utility as a financial resource. Their relationship developed slowly, based on shared interests and compatible temperaments rather than desperation or financial considerations. Elena was a retired teacher who had raised 3 children and buried a husband after 45 years of marriage. She understood loss and loneliness, but had maintained relationships with her family that provided support without sacrifice of independence. She served as a model for healthy family dynamics, demonstrating that love didn't require financial incentive or constant accommodation of unreasonable demands. Janet visited occasionally now, genuinely seeking reconciliation rather than financial opportunity. These visits were tentative but honest, marked by conversations about neutral topics that sometimes evolved into discussions of family history and shared memories. She was learning to see her father as a person rather than a problem, recognizing that his choices had been motivated by normal human needs rather than character flaws or mental incompetence. David remained more distant, struggling with pride and the discomfort of needing to acknowledge error. His visits were less frequent and more formal, marked by careful conversation that avoided topics that might lead to confrontation or emotional revelation. He was gradually accepting that his father had established boundaries that wouldn't be negotiated or modified through pressure or manipulation. Tyler came every other weekend, learning woodworking in Art's small workshop space, asking questions about family history and factory life, developing the relationship with his grandfather that had been delayed but not destroyed. The boy was curious and intelligent, interested in how things worked and why people made the choices they made. His questions revealed intelligence and emotional maturity that his parents had underestimated. During one of these visits, while they worked on a birdhouse that Tyler planned to hang in his backyard, the boy asked, "Grandpa, are you rich now?" Art considered the question seriously. "I'm comfortable, Tyler. I don't worry about paying bills anymore and I can afford to help people I care about. But more than that, I'm free." "Free from what?" "Free from needing other people's permission to be worth something. I spent too many years believing that love had to be earned through perfect behavior, that making mistakes meant I deserved to be punished. Turns out, that's not how real love works. Even with family, especially with family." Art had learned to recognize abandonment when it whispered, had developed the ability to distinguish between its voice and his own thoughts. The entity still lived in his memory, still provided commentary on relationships and choices, but it no longer controlled his present circumstances or future possibilities. He could acknowledge its presence without accepting its conclusions, hear its warnings without allowing them to determine his behavior. When Alina answered the phone during David's latest call requesting funding for Tyler's private school education, Art felt gratitude for having someone in his life who could serve as a buffer between him and demands that masqueraded as family connection. David, Tyler's welcome in my life as my grandson, not as a business investment, Art said when he took the phone. You figure out his schooling. I'll figure out how to be his grandfather. These boundaries felt strange and necessary, lines drawn not from anger but from self-respect. Art had discovered that love without respect was manipulation, that family obligations were mutual rather than one-sided, that his worth as a person didn't depend on his usefulness to others or his willingness to purchase their affection through financial generosity. He no longer waited for his phone to ring with the desperate hope that had characterized his earlier solitude. He no longer measured his value by his children's approval or his grandchildren's affection. Abandonment still existed in his experience, but as a memory of pain rather than a current reality, a teacher that had shown him the difference between genuine love and conditional acceptance. On quiet evenings, Art would sit in his improved apartment, surrounded by evidence of a life that served his own interests as well as others, and feel something he had rarely experienced: satisfaction with his own choices. The lottery money had revealed truths about his family relationships that might have remained hidden in poverty, but more importantly, it had given him the resources to create the life he actually wanted, rather than accepting the limitations others imposed. The birdhouse he and Tyler built together hung outside his kitchen window, occupied by a small family of finches who had made it their permanent home. Art watched them in the mornings as he prepared coffee, noting their busy efficiency and their obvious contentment with simple pleasures. They reminded him that home was something you created rather than something you inherited, that family was defined by care and presence rather than biology and obligation. Sometimes Janet called just to talk, without agenda or request. Sometimes David stopped by when he was in the neighborhood, slowly rebuilding the relationship he had abandoned. These interactions were cautious but genuine, marked by mutual recognition that trust required time and consistency to reestablish, that forgiveness was a process rather than an event. But Art no longer needed their approval to validate his existence. He had learned the difference between loneliness and solitude, between isolation and independence, between being abandoned and choosing his own company. The lottery ticket had given him financial security, but more importantly, it had revealed the strength that had existed within him all along, waiting for circumstances that would require its use. The morning calculator routine had been replaced by planning activities and managing investments, but Art still kept the old device in his kitchen drawer, a reminder of a time when limitation had taught him creativity and resilience. He understood now that those years of careful budgeting and strategic accommodation had been preparation for this period of choice and possibility. Abandonment no longer lived in his apartment. In its place, Art had discovered autonomy, the revolutionary understanding that his happiness was his own responsibility and his own achievement. He was 71 years old, comfortable for the first time in decades, and finally free to discover who he could become when other people's expectations no longer defined his possibilities.